I started working in the old master painting department at Christie's in London in 1983, and quite rapidly became interested in Canaletto as a problem because it was clear that the existing literature on Canaletto was very out of date, and that all sorts of paintings which shouldn't be accepted as Canaletto's work were in fact being sold as his work. It was because of my background in the commercial world that I realized the extent of the problem, and also the need to differentiate Canaletto's work from that of imitators and indeed from other members of his family.
Giovanni Antonio Canal, that was better known as Canaletto, is actually one of my favorite painters. He has an interesting story because he was the son of a painter of theatrical scenes. So his first training is in scenes, in theaters, and that was really helpful because it helped him train his skills in perspective, in draftsmanship, skills that obviously he then applied later on in his views, his vedute, as we say in Italian, of Venice, of his city.
And this is hugely before the age of any kind of photographic reproductions. So if you were on the Grand Tour and you wanted to bring back a souvenir of what you had seen in Venice and to show that off in your great home, in the UK, you would hire a painter such as Canaletto to make an image for you. He was not the only one, but he was one of the most famous of this genre or this kind of subject matter.
When he's in his mid-20s, he suddenly starts showing enormous talent for this kind of thing. There's a natural sort of reaction to effects of light and the way that light falls on buildings, the way that shadows fall, and light and atmosphere, which sets him completely apart from his few predecessors as painters of the city of Venice.
Gentile Bellini did this great procession of the True Cross that happens with the background of Piazza San Marco. Vittore Carpaccio will have these scenes very much populated with figures. So somehow the figures always take center stage. Even Luca Carlevaris, another important artist that was an influence for Canaletto, and it's almost considered the founder of Venetian Vedutismo. Even in his views, you get a sense that figures are really important. So what's striking about Canaletto is that Venice is the protagonist. Venice as the city with its wonderful, unique architecture, its canals, its distinctive light, it becomes really this subject of the composition. Now, of course, nowadays we have iPhones and cameras and we can do it ourselves. But back then, these vedutisti, these view painters, really had an ability to render the city. And there were collectors that would buy the works and bring them back to England. Some were commissioning works.
Among the Venetian view painters, the temptation to repeat the same thing over and over again must have been huge, because unless your clients actually knew each other, you could get away with painting sort of 10 identical views of the Piazza San Marco and selling them to different people, and probably no one would ever know. The remarkable thing about Canaletto is actually how varied his production is. There are very, very few paintings which really can be described as replicas of others. He almost always adopts a different viewpoint, puts in different figures, varies the view as much as he possibly can.
And what makes our picture particularly interesting is that he painted this before he was actually very popular.
Timothy and Angelica, in conversation, mentioned to me that they thought that they might have discovered a Canaletto, and that they would like me to look at the picture, assess its condition, and then potentially take some samples.
I was surveying our holdings and going in rack after rack We actually didn't have painting racks, we just had stacks, and you'd pull the painting out, and I simply did that one after the other, regardless of what department the work of art was assigned to. So there's painting and sculpture, there's modern and contemporary, there's Western, there's Native American, and so I went with a couple of my staff members, and we simply pulled everything out. And lo and behold, we pulled this out and discovered, and I said, it was my OMG moment. Oh my God, what is this?
But then, by looking at it, he began having suspicion. So we send it to, we show it to some experts of the artist, in particular Charles Bennington.
Yeah, Timothy Standring sent me some JPEGs of it, and I immediately thought, looking at those, that it looked like a genuine painting, and of particular interest because that particular precise composition is unknown in Canaletto's work. I mean, it's the full sort of symmetrical view of the Piazzetta is something that Luca Carlavaris, his predecessor, certainly painted, but until now there was no known example by Canaletto. So I suppose it was something that one might well have assumed existed, but there was no evidence of where such a thing might be.
Pictures usually within collections have a history, a provenance. And typically with Canaletto's pictures, is most of their pictures provenance usually go through Italy or England. This picture, oddly enough, its provenance suggests it's gone through France. So at whatever point in this picture's history, instead of traveling the normal route and therefore getting cataloged and recorded in history as a known Canaletto, it got overlooked.
We researched extensively the catalogue raisonné, which means the books that have all the works of art of an artist published, and this was not in the catalogue raisonné. There were drawings that were related to it, and they were early drawings, which of course later on is consistent with our dating of this painting, and we know the dating simply based on the architecture in the image itself.
And so I was particularly excited to see it and flew out there at the earliest opportunity to look at it, and had no question whatsoever but that unrecognized until now, it is certainly a genuine and particularly attractive painting by Canaletto.
And the style of the painting is also closer to early Canaletto because it doesn't have the same precision of later Canalettos, in which he would work out schematic formulas of painting and pretty much paint according to a system that he had developed as part of his studio practice. There are pentimenti in this.
Pentimento literally means repentance. Is basically, it's the artist during the conception of the composition, is the artist changing his mind. So he might have a drawing underneath that shows a different composition, but when he paints, he's actually changing it. And even sometimes after he has painted it, he changes his mind and will make another change. And sometimes the thinning of the paint through time brings out those early stages, those early compositional choices.
It's a very high quality work, dating from early in his career, which to me is the most interesting period. I'm sure it dates from the early 1720s, fairly soon after he's set himself up as a painter of Venetian views, which is why at this early stage in his career he's sort of taking one of the sort of standard views of his predecessors and doing something new with it.
Fortunately, we've got a fairly well-preserved painting that hasn't suffered hugely from as much damage as many 17th and 18th century paintings could have done.
It clearly hadn't been cleaned for many decades, and although it was still very clearly by Canaletto, it was also very clear that a sensitive restoration would bring back a life in it which had become slightly dull.
First phase of a conservation treatment is examination. And usually, basically what we're trying to achieve in that is to learn as much as we can about the picture before we really dive into any sort of hands-on treatment. When the painting first came into the conservation lab, Timothy and I immediately noticed signs of previous restorations, particularly along the sides, which significantly disfigured the painting. As the previous restorer's varnished age, it darkened unevenly and was very distracting to the eye. There were also some textural and compositional inaccuracies in the restorations themselves that needed to be corrected. The painting was lined, meaning that it was the original canvas was adhered to a secondary canvas. And what we discovered is the reason why that was done, more than likely, is because there's a tear in the center of the picture. And you couldn't just simply mend that tear and reweave that canvas to regain enough structural strength. During the examination phase, ultraviolet A radiation, more commonly known as blacklight, was used to help characterize and differentiate between materials. In this case, we were able to tell that a natural resin varnish was applied due to the illuminated greenish coloration. The dark spots seen in the image point out the restorer's hand. An X-ray, like the one you would find in a hospital, was also used for non-invasive examination. This is where the tear in the canvas was exposed, as well as other major areas of loss. Based on the nature of the lining, the stretcher that it was on, that wooden armature, it all suggested that that was the last restoration was probably in the late 1800s or early 1900s in Europe. The cleaning process is generally described as unpacking the surface. First, I'll use a solution to remove only the top layer of dirt and grime and nicotine that typically coats old works like this one. Then I'll come up with a solution specifically for removing the natural resin varnish that will not react with the original paint before going in to remove the overpaint. Sometimes the restoration, the old overpaint will come up with that same solution, and that's really wonderful if it does. Very often it doesn't. If it doesn't, we have to go on with different solvents. Perhaps we have to put those solvents in gels in order to control their locations and the speed at which they begin to solvate and swell these restoration materials, and then we can easily go in and control their removal in a very safe way without harming the original paint. One thing that I observed was that the old lining adhesive was breaking down, and as it was breaking down, it was creating a very distracting surface topography to the canvas. For the canvas deformations to be corrected, the previous lining needed to be removed from the original canvas, worked on, and re-adhered to a new lining fabric. First, a piece of Japanese tissue was adhered to the surface for protection with a starch-based adhesive. Then I used a palette knife to separate the lining and remove the old glue from the reverse of the original canvas. To reduce the deformations in the canvas, I used a vacuum hot table, which uses controlled heat and suction along with a little added moisture to first relax the canvas and flatten out any bumps and undulations. The vacuum hot table is used again to adhere the painting to the new lining canvas, and then it's put back on the original wood stretcher with the original metal tacks. After the structural treatment is complete, it really moves on to sort of the cosmetic phase. After the leveling is done and texturing is complete, then you start the actual cosmetic compensation. In painting means I'm applying color only to areas of loss. Basically, overpaint is you're applying color to areas of extant on top of extant paint. People often think that restoration is sort of being very artistic. It's really far more controlled and far less interpretive and speculative than many might believe. Our work is not supposed to be viewed as the work. Our whole point is for you to be able to see the artist's original work and its beauty and its uniqueness, not ours. And by filling in these areas as best we can or as neutrally as possible, allows the viewer to see all of that, see the picture as it should be interpreted.
He was very precise, so you really see the view and how Venice looked in the 1700s in a way that no other narration in a way can really give in such an immediate way.
Looking at this painting, one's looking at the view that would be seen by any grand visitor to Venice in the 18th century. I mean, nowadays, visitors to Venice almost invariably arrive on the other side of the city, either by rail or by air. In those days, visitors generally arrived by boat at the Molo and would be greeted by this assembly of some of the most prominent buildings of Venice.
The true campanile of Venice, which actually fell in the 19th century, it collapsed. And actually it's the model for the Cook Daniels clock tower on 16th Street. And on the right-hand side is the Doge's palace, which stands before the Basilica of San Marco.
The square has this great variety of figures in groupings, two chatting and one going, on its way, and people on the boats. People are busy with their businesses and busy with their activities. Venice, you have to think, was a republic, but it was also an incredible marketplace. Was sort of at the crossroads of major road from the east and the west, from the north. And so activities, business, transaction, trades was very much the daily activities of whoever was living in Venice.
And we found out that the file had been refiled into another department. So it wasn't assigned to painting and sculpture, and there wasn't any reason why we would have known about it unless I'd gone into the stacks and pulled out each painting and looked at it.
I think the most fascinating thing for me was the fact that that Canaletto covered this more traditional type of sort of symmetrical view of the Piazzetta. And I sort of rather kicked myself for not having guessed that such a thing would turn up.
It's a very romantic city. It's a city that has been celebrated in novels, in movies, and poetry, and certainly in art. And Canaletto is really the artist of Venice, the artist that brought the city alive through his views. And even if you've never been to Venice, it's a way to, in a way, transport yourself virtually to that city through the eyes of a 1700s artist. So to me, it's quite special.
It makes it even more thrilling that we have this, and that we get to play art historian and restorer out here in the Rockies.
Yeah, absolutely. It's quite a find.
Yeah.